Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to our first Moggcast of the new year. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation remotely, alas, with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning to you.
Good morning, Paul.
First of all, since we're all in lockdown, I thought I'd ask you a question broadly in the field of your domestic circumstances. Presumably, none of your children, 6 of them, I believe, are at school, and they're all learning from home.
That's absolutely right. My youngest isn't yet of school age, so 5 of them are learning remotely. It's much easier for the older ones. It's quite difficult for the youngest, who needs a considerable amount of help from Helena, my wife.
How's it going? Is everyone competing for the same equipment? Is it much noisier than usual as person A, who's studying, asking person B to jolly well keep quiet?
Well, I'm in London Monday to Thursday because I need to be in Parliament, and they're all in Somerset. So I only hear the noise when I'm back down on Friday, and I have had to do calls relating to public business in the same room as children doing remote learning, because that's the way the signal crumbles.
I thought this would be a way into a discussion about schools, in that I'm in broadly the same situation as you, only with fewer children. But there are lots of people who will not be in the same, I think, relatively comfortable position that we are. You have children whose parents you hope are supportive. We have houses, we have gardens. It is very, very tough, isn't it, for families who are not in that position and may not even have the requisite equipment, and whose schools are probably not as good as yours and mine are.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you make an extremely fair point, and I've been conscious of this throughout the lockdown, that having a garden is a huge advantage over people who don't, and this is irrespective of schooling. I'm lucky that I need to come in to work, and I think that's a benefit for people who have to go into work, that they're not stuck at home the whole time, particularly if they don't have a garden. And I think it's tough for children who obviously have lots of energy that they need to wear off, and they can go out for exercise. That's not quite the same as playing games at school. And even with good equipment and good teachers and parents who are involved, remote learning is not as good as physical learning at a school.
In retrospect, given the emergence of the new variants, unexpected but not completely unpredictable, shouldn't we really have all prepared last year to do everything online this year?
I don't think those preparations would have made an enormous amount of difference, because the point you make is that online learning is not as good as real learning, regardless of how well it's being done. And therefore, the additional preparation would have been marginal. I also think it was very important and right the whole way through that the government has always been reluctant to restrict people's freedoms and has wanted life to be as normal as possible, and only restricted it when it has had to do so. And that if we'd had a different type of government that had sort of taken glee in restricting people's freedoms, I don't think you would have had the consent that we have seen to the restrictions that have been imposed. And I think as a country, we have broadly accepted the restrictions consensually rather than having them coerced upon us. And I think that's really important, and I think it's made it easier for people to accept the restrictions and for the good ordering of society.
On schools, there's a big push now, including from some of your colleagues, to get schools open again as soon as possible. And of course, the government will want to do that. But isn't there a difficulty endemic in this, in that the government doesn't directly employ teachers? The teachers won't go, and they'll be backed by the unions if death figures are high, which they are, if hospitals are full, which they are, and if there are a lot of cases, which they are. And we naturally hope all this will change and expect it will when vaccination comes in. But until that point, there really is this big practical obstacle in terms of getting children back at the moment. Is there not?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the vaccinations, and the rollout of vaccination is going well. That even more people have been vaccinated by the time this call is broadcast than the just shy of 6 million, which is the figure that we've currently got. So that is encouraging. But I think the point you make is that the government would not have sought to close schools if it hadn't recognised that it was necessary to do so to try and stop the spread of the disease, and that it won't reopen them until it's confident that it is safe to do so. So I don't think the problem is as great as you are suggesting. I think by the time they are reopened, people will recognise that that is the right thing to do. I go back to my fundamental point I've been banging on about throughout the last year, that this has all happened with the consent of the British people. Actually, if you look at last year, people began locking themselves down before the government introduced the laws to do it. And I think that's fundamental. I think the government has worked with the British people rather than ordering the British people. And that applies in schooling as much as in anything else. And if you want a liberal democratic society to work, government has to understand that it's limited in what it can order unless it has the support of the people that is encouraging to do things. And I think that's been fundamental to how we've operated in the last year, and that will continue.
I understand the point you're making. Indeed, you've been making it, as you say, ever since we began the Moggcast exchanges on these matters. But just going back for a moment, I think that some of what you said a moment ago is that this problem with the teachers really won't be a problem in due course, because everything will open up, the vaccination programme will continue, and schools will go back. But some of your colleagues think it's a problem now, don't they?
Well, we have to add, God willing, that we hope that these things will happen. And we can't obviously be certain as to how things will happen, but the way the vaccine rollout is going is certainly encouraging. The government is absolutely committed to reopening schools as soon as possible, as soon as it is reasonable to do so. And it is a priority above reopening other things. I chat, of course, to many of my friends on the backbenches, and the thing I constantly say to them is I'm convinced that they would do the same if they were in the Prime Minister's shoes. I think we have no greater advocate of freedom within the Conservative Party than Boris Johnson, and that he has never wanted to lock people down. He doesn't want to lock people down, but he has had to do so, and has done so, as I say, with the consent of the British people because of the pandemic that we have faced. And I think anybody faced with the decisions that he has had to make would have come to the same conclusion.
Should teachers be assigned a high place, really go to the front of the queue, as President Obama didn't put it, when the first group of people have been vaccinated?
I think dealing with the highest risk people is obviously absolutely the right thing to do. That the people who are targeted to be vaccinated by the middle of February make up 88% of the deaths from COVID. So it must be right to prioritise them. What you're saying about teachers, and the chief of the police of the metropolis has made the same argument about the police, is a very strong argument that those in the forefront of public services absolutely have a high priority.
If it's a teachers-police trade-off, what on earth do ministers do?
The rollout of the vaccine is going so fast that with nearly 500,000 every day, I think these trade-offs become easier because the Oxford vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine are being rolled out quickly, and that's really what we're depending upon. But we've also got to be sensible about the levels of risk. That, as I said, 88% of deaths are in the high-risk categories who should be vaccinated by the middle of February. When you go outside that group, COVID is a nasty disease, but it's much less likely to be fatal. And so you've got to be proportionate about the risk as you look at how things reopen and who is on the priority list. Should you prioritise a 49-and-a-half-year-old policeman against a 20-year-old teacher? That becomes a really interesting question. And frankly, I will be told what to do by the chief medical officer when it comes to this sort of decision, because he knows a good deal more about it than I do.
Moving from schools to airports, there's a view, and it's clearly informed by what's happened in Israel, where the government's closed the airports, that a possible way forward now is to close all the airports, insulate the country, so to speak, from new variants of the virus coming in that may not be seen off by the vaccines. You have closed the airports down and you can open the economy up. What do you think about
that? There are inevitably trade-offs in all the closures that are made in the various forms of economic activity that are continued with or are not continued with. Ultimately, COVID is a global problem, and we will need to see the vaccine rolled out across the world, and we want countries across the world to have it. We're doing a lot to support developing countries in getting the vaccine, but that it's obviously sensible to try and limit the risk of reinfection or new infection at the point at which the vaccine has made the UK safe.
Which suggests closure of the airports in part or whole, does it not?
Well, it suggests being careful, and lots of provisions have been put in place to make travel safer, not just for the people travelling, but also for the people they're travelling with and for the people they visit when they arrive. I mean, if you look at what other countries have done, I don't know if you've noticed, but Test Match Special is broadcasting watching the telly at home rather than being able to go out to Sri Lanka because they're not able to fly to Sri Lanka. And they've done it extraordinarily well, actually, considering the difficulties. But countries are taking precautions to protect themselves, and that's quite understandable, and that's inevitably going to continue.
You're a Test Match Special regular.
I've enjoyed Test Match Special since childhood years, yes.
When do you watch it?
Well, I don't. I listen to it because it's on the radio. So I take it from that, Paul, you're not an aficionado of Test Match Special.
Not since the 1970s, when I remember it was John Arnott, was it not?
Oh, indeed. John Arnott, a great commentator. I miss Henry Blofeld, whose retirement was a great loss, but John Agnew is superb and a worthy successor.
I shall put at the bottom of the extract on the Moggcast tomorrow, the editor reveals his ignorance of Test Match Special, or at least forgetfulness. Going back to the virus, your colleagues, some of them at any rate, it's the COVID recovery group, want the deadline of the 15th of February for the Prime Minister to begin announcing his plan for coming out of lockdown. Is this really practical to give dates like this?
The Prime Minister said that there will be a review in mid-February anyway. So very helpfully, some Tory MPs are suggesting that the Prime Minister should do exactly what he intends to do. I think this is a marvellous indication of the natural loyalty of members of the Tory party.
Is there a review with a timetable for leaving lockdown?
I think timetables are not particularly realistic because we are in the hands of events that are not within our control. And we've seen that throughout the whole of the last year. I think what has been crucial, and this is in the legislation, is that these very restrictive laws have to be reviewed. They can't just carry on forever. But you can't set a timetable for ending them because you don't know what the progress of the virus will or will not be. What we want to avoid, what's really important to avoid, is what happened after the Second World War, when some of the restrictions weren't removed until the 1960s, late 1960s, because they happened to be convenient to the government. And fortunately, the structure of the COVID laws is one where they have to be reviewed and they need votes in Parliament for their continuation. And I think that's a real safeguard for our liberties in the longer term. Because the nature of government is once it gets power, it doesn't like to give it up. And this has been structured in a way that the powers don't last forever.
What do you feel when you read people on the right of politics, some of them within the Conservative Party itself, accusing the government of being fascists, in effect, locking everyone down, wanting to put members of the cabinet on trial in a tribunal after the coronavirus, we hope, recedes.
I think this is ridiculous. As I said earlier, I think that anybody in the position of the Prime Minister or in the position of being in government would have come to the same decisions, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And readers of Conservative Home got very interested in the Swedish model last year. And there was a period at which it looked as if Sweden was getting everything right. And then it turned out that Sweden wasn't, actually, and that countries have taken various approaches. But in the end, lockdown does have the effect, and there's a lot of evidence to show this, of suppressing peaks. And it's why the vaccine is so important. The discussion would be very different if we had no prospect of a vaccine. But we have a vaccine that's actually being distributed whilst we are speaking. In the 20 minutes we'll be speaking, hundreds of people, into the thousands of people will have been vaccinated. And that changes the argument, because if you can suppress the peak and you have an exit, then suppressing the peak is worth the suspension of liberties. If the suppression of the peak had no consequence because there was no vaccine, then it's a very different discussion. But I think any rational person would have come to the same conclusions as the Prime Minister.
Do you applaud the efforts of your colleague and our columnist, Neil O'Brien, who I know is the most mild-mannered of people, but who is pursuing to the ends of the earth people he regards as lockdown skeptics and deniers, distinguished journalists, Julia Hartley-Brewer, Toby Young, Peter Hitchens, pursuing them with records of what he claims are errors that they've made. Is this something that members of Parliament should be doing?
Speaking as a son of a journalist, I'm perhaps slightly torn. But actually, no, I think it's a really important contribution to the debate. Neil has also been putting very helpful pieces of information on Conservative WhatsApp groups so that Conservative MPs see the arguments as well. In an era of fake news, it is important that people challenge news and put the alternative points of view or correct facts. And look, I'm a great supporter of the journalistic trade, and commentators need to be absolutely free in the speech that they have. And it was really pretty disgraceful when talk radio got suspended by one of the internet providers because they didn't like what they'd being said. That was an attack on free speech and was fortunately reversed pretty quickly. But people should be held to account for what they say. And I think Neil's done a fantastic job and has written, well, you've written this, and I agree with you, has influenced the debate by putting the facts forward. I don't know if he'll be complimented by this, but I think he is of coronavirus as Bill Cash was to Brexit, that by putting the facts and getting them right, Bill laid the intellectual basis for why we ended up leaving the European Union. And Neil is finding the intellectual basis for support for the government's position, and that's really important.
By being like Bill Cash, you mean he's still going to be doing this in the House of Commons at the age of 80?
I don't think it'll go on that long.
We must hope. Look, I'm very grateful to you for today's Moggcast, in which we've not covered a great width of ground because we've stuck to the coronavirus, but hopefully we've probed some of the issues in depth. It's a pity that we've not been able to conduct this in person, but who knows, given the speed at which vaccination is going, we may be able to do so again soon.
It's always an interesting conversation, so thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.